Hi everybody. Thank you very much to Saskia and to the staff of the Boijmans for inviting me to speak today. It's a bit daunting to be speaking with the rest of the amazing speakers, but I'll give it a go. So for the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to discuss Gabrielle Keiller, her collection in terms of its key influences and distinguishing features, and the way in which it was informed and her motivations behind collecting it. So I'll also kind of focus a little bit on her relationship with the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art, which led to the inclusion of works from her collection in the extraordinary current exhibition, Mad About Surrealism. I'm really indebted to the writings of the contributors to the catalogue for this exhibition and to the generosity of my colleagues, who readily shared their knowledge and anecdotes about Keiller and her collection with me, especially to Keith Hartley, curator of the Edinburgh leg of this touring exhibition, who knew Keiller personally from the time she occupied an advisory position on our acquisitions committee of the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art between 1978 and 1985. I speak today from my position as curatorial assistant on the first leg of the show, which I worked alongside Keith and colleagues from the Hamburger Kunsthalle and the Boijmans Museum on planning an installation of this show in Edinburgh last summer. It's really amazing to be able to see it again today and how different everything looks. It's great. So I'll begin with a brief overview of the collection and go on to discuss the different influences and key individuals and experiences that shaped her collection, looking at a selection of important artworks and items from her library and archive as I do this. In comparison to many collectors, Keiller actually owned a relatively small quantity of artworks, but the works she did collect tend to be significant ones, such as these works here by Francis Piccabia's Girl Born Without a Mother from about 1916 to 17, and Hannah Hirsch's photo montage work from 1929 from the collection from the Ethnographic Museum. Also quite well-known works in the collection are a Max Ernst showing a young girl the head of his father by Max Ernst, and René Magritte's representation from 1937. So this is his only painting with a specially shaped canvas, and it looks really amazing upstairs. Actually, it's presented, as you'll see, as a kind of object on a plinth, and you can see the back and the front, which is really a nice touch. So while her collection includes key works by Marcel Duchamp, Ernst, Hirsch, Magritte, Piccabia, and Man Ray, among others, the aspect it's really most renowned for is the holdings of rare archive and library items, which include an original script by Salvador Dali for an unrealized film about surrealism. So you'll see some extracts, and it's on display upstairs as well. So it has 13 typed pages in total, and kind of annotations and drawings in the margins. So it was kind of supposed to be, like a documentary about surrealism, and the episodes were planned to include recitals of the key definitions of surrealism, such as surrealism can be practiced by everyone. And it references Freud's theories of the unconscious and the pleasure principle as well with the illustrations. So the archive also contains a series of fiery correspondence between André Breton and Dali in the 1930s, which documents Dali's expulsion from and subsequent reconciliation with the Surrealist group. And an extensive collection of Dada and Surrealist reviews, which record the movement through the publishing and promoting activities of those involved. So her collection of reviews, seen here installed in Surreal Encounters in Edinburgh, such as 291, The Blind Man, La Révolution Surréaliste, and Littérature, is extremely rare in the UK. So as well as collecting retrospectively, Keiller continuously supported and collected the work of living artists in Britain, such as Richard Long, Edoardo Paolozzi, and Ian Hamilton Finlay. And that's kind of key as well to the way in which she collected the work. So the strength and the strength of the archive and library holdings within her collection demonstrates Keiller's interest in the private and documentary side of Dada and Surrealism. She was profoundly aware of the fact that these movements should be understood, or should not be understood, as they often are, for the output of painters and sculptors alone, but as protean, multidisciplinary, multiform activities that were in radical dialogue with the socio-political events of the first half of the 20th century. For Keiller, that those aspects of the movement were preserved with the possibility to be read alongside and to contextualize the other objects in her collection was really vital. The bequest of her entire collection to the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art in 1995, where it joined the archive and library of Roland Penrose and many works from his collection, augmented the reputation of the gallery as an internationally regarded institution for the study of Dada and Surrealism. So, who was Gabrielle Keiller, and how did she come to amass this body of art and archive material? So, Gabrielle Ritchie was born in East Lothian in Scotland in 1908. Her parents were actually on a golfing holiday there at the time. Her family were from Rutland in England, and that's where she grew up. And incidentally, Edward James was also born during his parents' golfing trip nearby in East Lothian a year before that. So maybe there's some kind of connection between that and collecting surrealism. So yeah, Keiller went on to become a golfing champion actually later in life. So her birthplace seems to have kind of been premonitory in some way. Her golfing career was put on hold during the Second World War when she drove for the auxiliary ambulance service in London, as she's pictured here on the right. But she resumed golfing afterwards and went on to have some quite big wins in Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Monaco. So in 1995, she gave up golf completely, and from that point on began to concentrate her energies on archaeology and collecting art. So the money behind, where she got her money was from both sides. Her mother was from a kind of well-known family of bankers and brewers who had quite a bit of money, and her father had inherited a million acres of land in Texas, which had become a huge ranch, and the sale of her inherited portion of that after the Second World War provided the funds for her to collect, to build her collection. So she was married 3 times, and her last husband, Alexander Keiller, whom she met in 1950, or who she married in 1951, is the one whose name she kept with her. The 2 previous marriages had been brief, and she had 1 son from her first marriage. Alexander Keiller was heir to the Scottish fruit preserves dynasty, Keiller and Sons, and Gabrielle would sign letters to her close friends with an M inside of a Q to signify Marmalade Queen, after the Keiller Company's best-known product. Together, they bought Telegraph Cottage in 1953, a large house on the outskirts of London, which had once been the residence of General Eisenhower during the war. Just a random fact, Rona. So this is an image of the interior of the house, and it was called a cottage, but I think that's a bit of a stretch of the word cottage. It was huge. And she had also her garden. She had an extensive garden where she had various artworks on display. This is one that Richard Long made especially for the garden in 1981. And also the garden was populated by various Paolozzi sculptures. Alexander Keiller was a well-known archaeologist, and he was associated with the excavation and restoration of Avebury stone circles in the south of England in the 1930s, which he funded completely himself. So that's Alexander Keiller in the front centre there with his excavation team. So what's quite interesting about, I was reading a bit about these stones and his work on resurrecting them, and I found out that they were actually ignited a good bit of interest with the British artists associated with surrealism, Paul Nash, and also Eileen Agar. And so Nash had visited Avebury both before and after Keiller's restoration, and that's just some photographs of the stones at Avebury. They're kind of quite unusual and huge. And this is Paul Nash leaning against one of the stones on the left, and then a photograph that he took of the stones on the right. He was just really, really interested in the kind of their presence, really. And he corresponded with Alexander Keiller about the restoration in the 30s. So he made several works in response to his encounters with them, such as this work here, Equivalents for the Megaliths from 1935. And so, although he was appreciative of Keiller's work on the project and respectful of his dedications to cultural heritage, he preferred his initial experience with the stones when they were half buried rather than when they were resurrected. So in a letter dated May 1937, Nash writes about his interest in these, both in terms of their composition of line, but also, he states, in the irrational sense, in their suggestion of a super reality. So in an essay published in Tate Papers in 2005, Sam Smiles suggests that Nash's paintings and drawings relating to Avebury and other henge monuments propose, quote, a mode of engagement with prehistory that works with what cannot be known, what must be intuited. Indeed, there's a sense of surprise and discontinuity is as much a presence here as any idea of trans-historical communion. Above all, perhaps, Nash seems to insist on the impossibility of any final understanding of such a mute and incomprehensible monument, which erupts into consciousness as from a dream. End quote. So Keiller was himself a collector, and he gathered vast holdings of Ushabti and Egyptian antiquities, 18th century archaeological manuscripts, erotica, and some 240 books on witchcraft and archaeology dating from the 15th century onwards. So together they built some quite unusual collections, and one of these consisted of hundreds of pottery cow creamers, which filled the entire room in their home. And these are just kind of like these jugs that you have milk or cream with tea or coffee with, and for some reason they were incredibly into these cow creamers. So they also had a whole collection of silver ones as well, quite similar, and they're now part of the museum in Stoke-on-Trent in England, if you want to go visit them. So not only was this partnership with Alexander Keiller fruitful in terms of collecting, it also ignited a long-standing interest in and dedication to archaeology and cultural heritage, which I think might have been a link to the Dada and Surrealist items she would later collect, especially in terms of the collage works of Ernst, and also those of the surrealist, latter-day surrealist, Edoardo Paolozzi, both of whose works she collected enthusiastically. So when Alexander died in 95, she gave up golf forever, and she started to focus on archaeology and art, among other things. And her life took kind of many different directions, starting from being a champion sports person to a photographer in the British Museum in the archaeology department, and to being a tour guide and lecturer at Tate. And she was a dedicated collector of Dada and Surrealism, and patron of contemporary artists in the UK. So Paolozzi, whom she developed a close friendship with through her support of his practice, described the epochs of her life as strata, or similar to a cross-section of the earth in a children's book. The changing patterns of her interests and dedications were distinct yet built upon those preceding. He referred to the bracelet covered in golf medals that she always wore as a talisman from her earlier life. So beginning in 1956, she started volunteering with the archaeology department at the British Museum, where she worked for over a decade, actually, and she kind of did mostly photography for them. And she was involved in the research and documentation of a really famous discovery, the Sutton Hoo ship burial in the south of England. So as you'll see here, it's a 27-metre long imprint of a ship over 1,400 years old, which was discovered in 1939, along with a burial chamber packed full of treasures. And it was kind of referred to as a ghost ship, because as you can see, all that was left was this kind of shadow imprint, because all the wood from the boat had just rotted away. So there was just that, and then those little dots are the metal bolts that remained preserved. So Gabrielle's photographs of this actually feature in the catalogue that the British Museum published of the find. So to tie back into the comment just about thinking about the links between her archaeological work and her interest in collage, I'll just mention these two works briefly. So Ernst's La Femme sans tête from 1929 and Paolozzi's Hermès von Praxitele from 1953. So yeah, Ernst on the left and Paolozzi on the right. And collage makes up a huge element of Keiller's collection as well. And the collage by Paolozzi is composed from secondhand books of art and archaeology, and featuring illustrations of antique sculptures, kind of superimposed machine elements, taken from specialist manuals. So in the preface to La Femme sans tête, André Breton describes the collages as veritable slits in time, space, customs, and even beliefs. The collision of temporalities may be separated by 1,400 years, signalled by the unearthing of the Sutton Hoo ship burial, and the manifestation of the mysterious past in the present may offer a connection to the juxtapositions within the collage works such as these. So moving forward to the starting point for her collection, eventually, of Dada and Surrealism, what the key event was, as Saskia outlined, was the trip to Venice, where she met Peggy Guggenheim and saw her collection and was incredibly inspired by that. So they met through her friend, Gabrielle's friend, Wynne Henderson, who had been a gallery assistant at Guggenheim's gallery in London, Guggenheim Schön, in the 30s. And she was also introduced to Paolozzi. Seen there, looks like he's giving a speech or something, in her house in Telegraph Cottage at that time. So he was kind of, I guess, one of the people who had maybe the biggest influence on her collection. So that was obviously a very significant trip. So before she started to focus on and collect Dada and Surrealism, she'd started to collect pre-20th century works, even including works by Camille Corot and Renoir, and Cubist works by Picasso and Braque. So she also was collecting antique furniture and period silver, those pottery and porcelain cows, but much of the old masterwork and the Cubist and early modern works were sold off once her vision to collect Dada and Surrealism really took hold. Ernst's Tourme, or Towers, in 1916, a pre-Dada work bought in 1963, was her first purchase of a work that related to Dada or Surrealism. And in her essay for the catalogue for this exhibition, Elizabeth Cowling writes that this may have particularly appealed to her because, with its abstracted imagery of an urban roofscape of chimneys and gutters and its collage-like structure, it looks like an ancestor of many of Paolozzi of the late 1950s. And so Paolozzi openly acknowledged his artistic debt to both Dada and Surrealism, which many of his works kind of attest to. And he knew many of the individuals involved in both movements, including Tristan Tzara, a key figure in Zurich Dada, whose library he visited and which would have contained many of the books and journals that Keiller would later collect. He convinced Keiller Paolozzi convinced Keiller to collect works of Dada and Surrealism and persuaded her that it was a good time to collect because there was still prices were still relatively low at the time, in the 60s, 70s, and there was also major works were still coming onto the market then too. So for Keiller, I think getting to know Paolozzi's influences must have been one of a big motivation behind her collection and its focus as well. So beginning with Ernst's Towers, Keiller went on to build her collection steadily in the 60s, buying more works by Ernst and Picabia, among others. But the 70s was the decade where her collecting really kind of upped its pace, and the decade which she built her really impressive library in too. So she continued to buy into the 80s with works like Magritte's The Magic Mirror, 1929, among others. So she built her collection steadily through relationships with dealers including Freddie Mayer, Robert Fraser, Frank Lloyd, John and Paul Herring, and also through her friendship with Roland Penrose. She also bought 2 drawings by Dali from Edward James, and much of her archive and library material was bought from John Armbruster, a rare book specialist who bought a lot of the items from George Hugnier's collection, which he then sold to Keiller. So Hugnier is hugely important in Keiller's collection. Many of her rarest items come from his library and bear inscriptions to him from the makers. Hugnier, who owned a small bookbinding studio in Paris, was a central figure in the movement during the 30s. He was a close friend of Duchamp, and the editions of Duchamp's Box in a Suitcase and The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors Even, the Green Box, in our collection, both bear special dedications to him. His obsession with fine craftsmanship and penchant for designing his own covers for the books in his library resulted in the inclusion of many beautifully customized versions of artist books in Keiller's collection. For example, with his copy of Le Fou au Coul, translated as Fire in the Arse, 1943, this book includes etchings by Oscar Dominguez depicting people having sex which overlay Hugnier's text, an emblematic example of surrealist erotica and their love for the union of image and text on the page. Hugnier bound it in cream-coloured leather with specially made decalcomania end papers, set inside a folder lined in mushroom-coloured suede, enclosed further by a hard leather trimmed slipcase, itself lined in a soft white material, so quite extensive customizing. So many books within Keiller's collection are deluxe editions, meaning often that they were printed on kind of expensive and handmade papers. So she met and became friends with Roland Penrose in the late 70s and bought several works from his collection, including this one by Alberto Giacometti, Disagreeable Object to be Thrown Away, from 1931, which is one of my favorite works in the exhibition. Which was produced shortly after he joined the Surrealist group. And in referring to the works that he made in the period, Giacometti wrote, "For some years I have only realized sculptures that have appeared to me in my mind in a finished state. I have reproduced them in 3 dimensions without changing anything, without asking myself what they mean." So Elizabeth Cowling, in her essay, Gabrielle Keiller Collects, names Duchamp's Box in a Suitcase as the one object that could be said to sum up Gabrielle Keiller's collection. The reasons she gives are that the work is a key link between the main strands of the collection, So in terms of the wide reach of its influence, it links Dada surrealism and also the work of Paolozzi. She also states that Box in a Suitcase is representative of the particular character and scale of Keiller's collection, which was often made up of many items that are designed for the private collector particularly. These were often intimate in character, both in terms of their scale and also in terms of how they were intended to be engaged with. So Box in a Suitcase is really designed to be seen by just one or two people at a time. So the work itself is a kind of compact retrospective of miniatures of previous works made by Duchamp, all set within a suitcase. The leather case contains 69 miniature reproductions of the works. Our version is number 2 of 24 deluxe versions of this case. Each of these features a different hand-coloured original fixed to the inside of the lid. Ours contains a hand-coloured celluloid version of his iconic The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors Even, 1915-23, which stands upright in the centre of the box. For Duchamp, there was no clear distinction between the original and the reproduction, a concept cleverly embodied in this piece. Keiller also bought a group of letters to Heiner from Duchamp relating to the preparations for the boîte, which exist in the archive. She loved to browse among her treasures and admitted that she quite often unpacked and repacked Box in a Suitcase at home. So I was watching the film on our website of 2 conservators from the gallery as they open. So these are just stills from this kind of, I think, 4-minute long video where the conservators are taking it, opening it so slowly and meticulously and with the gloves and things like that. So it really sort of reminded me of this work that I'd seen last year in Glasgow by in Edinburgh, by a Glasgow-based artist called Aideen Doran, who made whose video Push Pop Stack from 2016 kind of explores this current online phenomenon of unboxing toys and new pieces of technology. So through her work, I found out that videos of people unboxing the latest objects of technology, especially iPhones in particular and things like that, and new toys are regularly the most watched things on YouTube. So Doran's film contains an excerpt from a YouTube video of the latest Nintendo Wii being opened, and this is overlaid with text from Flann O'Brien's novel, The Third Policeman, in which one of the characters sets about unpacking countless ornamental glass boxes from within one another, which eventually become so minuscule that they are no longer visible to the eye, so beautiful and terrifying that they are very nearly unmentionable. So staying with the theme of boxes, another key work from Keiller's collection is Duchamp's The Green Box, which contains preparatory notes, sketches, and photographs dating from 1911 to 15, relating to the iconic work that shares its title. Published under the name of his feminine alter ego, Rose Selavey, Duchamp's intention for this work was that it be experienced alongside The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors Even, or also referred to as The Large Glass. He said of The Green Box, quote, "I wanted that album to go with the glass and to be consulted when seeing glass, because, as I see it, it must not be looked at in the aesthetic sense of the word. One must consult the book and see the two together. The conjunction of the two things entirely removes the retinal aspect that I don't like." And also, the box contains photographs of the large glass taken by Man Ray before it was accidentally broken in transit. And it features images of the dust collecting on one of the glass panels, which looks like a kind of weird alien landscape of some kind. So the final aspect of her collection that I will discuss is her sets of Dada and Surrealist journals, whose contents reflect the wide range of their activities. Because of the kind of collector that Keiller was, we were lucky to have many full sets of these key periodicals of the movements, including 291, 391, The Blind Man, and La Révolution Surréaliste, among others. So in her introduction to the Magic Mirror catalogue, Cowling writes that nothing can bring one closer to the heart of the movements like Dada or Surrealism than the periodicals, the manifestos, the signed and dated copies of books, the letters and manuscripts, which bear witness to the constant interchange of ideas and the constant effort to win converts to the cause. To be able to study at first hand the flamboyantly eccentric topography and layout of 291 or 391, or the mock-scientific, studiedly deadpan design of La Révolution Surréaliste is a great privilege. The potent visual impact of the magazines closes the gap between our era and theirs, bringing vividly to life the urgent debates that animated both movements and dispelling the flattening, anodyne effect of academic history. So the Magic Mirror, which is some photographs of it here actually showing Keiller's works. It was an exhibition organised by the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art in 1988, and it was to showcase her collection, but it was anonymously showcased, so she was never mentioned. It was just a collector, private collector's collection, but the photographs are really amazing. I love this carpet in the foreground with the plants. I'm not really sure where that came from, but I think it looks really cool and contemporary. And that's how some of the publications were exhibited at the time. It kind of looks like they were scattered into the display case. So seeing her collection exhibited at the show really influenced Keiller's decision to bequeath her collection to the Gallery of Modern Art. And Richard Calva-Cressy, who was keeper of the gallery at the time of that show, was also influential in kind of persuading her that the donation of her collection to our gallery, to a still fairly young Gallery of Modern Art, which was opened in 1960, would make a significant difference to its development and its future. So 291 was a review published in New York during 1915 to 16, edited by Arthur Stieglitz. It set out to be an experimental journal dedicated to the most avant-garde tendencies in contemporary art. And Picabio was a regular contributor and published many of his early machine-inspired drawings within its pages. So his first machine-inspired painting, Girl Born Without a Mother, which was later owned by Keiller, appears in issue number 4. An iconic Dada work, the title of this painting seems to equate a steam locomotive with the daughter born without a mother, seemingly immaculately. He sort of painted the background in gold as a kind of reference and kind of mocking reference to Christian iconography as well. So 291 was also notably was distinguished for its dynamic and experimental typography, which often conflated image and text. Another significant review in the collection is La Révolution Surréaliste, which was the official organ of the movement, edited by Breton from the 4th issue onwards. It ran from 1924 to 29 and bears witness to discussions in the group at the time. So appearance-wise, it was modelled on a scientific journal called La Nature, and it's kind of without any of the extreme typography experiments of the earlier Dada journals. So certainly Keiller was drawn to the anarchic wit and unexpectedness of Dada and Surrealism. She was only too aware that Dada and Surrealism were literary movements before they developed visually, and that the interdependence of word and image was central to their ethos. As well as through the various reviews, this relationship is demonstrated in Tristan Tzara and Jan Arp's 25 poems from 1918. In this book, Zara's poems deliberately confound and confuse, liberating words from their burden as the carriers of meaning in a rational sense, and presenting them as a force in their own right. His gesture here continues to carry weight, especially, I note, in practices of contemporary art writing. The second issue of one of my favourite contemporary journals, F.R. David, which is published by De Appel in Amsterdam, and focuses on the status of writing and contemporary art practice. The second issue is dedicated to the exploration of the relationships between image and text and refers to Dada. So the second issue is called Stuff and Nonsense. I can't actually get the journal because it's out of the second issue, you can't get it. So these are just other issues, front covers. But the second issue, which I'm speaking about, is called Stuff and Nonsense, and it was published in 2008. And the editors used the issue to kind of protest against the perceived tyranny of communication demanded of writing and contemporary art practices. In her contribution, Marguerite Schevemakers explains that Dada deprived words, syllables, and sounds of all traditional semantic functions and references until they had become visual and concrete. This return to surface, to the materiality of language, was a deliberate introversion of the order of things that the Dadaists wished to provoke. And the editorial of Stuff and Nonsense poses a question of dreaming, which is, quote, "It is in the nature of things that they defy our control over their use, in ways that words can only dream of. Which begs the question, do words dream of other uses? If they do, then surely art is there to help and set language free, even if only by way of poetry." So Keiller's impact on the collection of the Scottish National Gallery of Art goes beyond her important bequest to us. She was, as an advisor on the acquisitions committee between 78 and 85, she was really active in some of the key acquisitions of the gallery's purchases. So following her bequest of her works to the gallery after her death in 1995, a special library and display room in the gallery was engineered to house Keiller's library and also Penrose's library, and contents from Penrose's cabinet of curiosities, which can be seen there in kind of background. So the Keiller Library is a kind of display space where we can show rare books and archive material in low lighting. And beyond that, just the room that you can see through the glass doors is a gallery dedicated to Roland Penrose and shows a changing display of surrealist works, which is pretty slim pickings at the moment because all the best ones are in Rotterdam. And also quite fittingly in the same building is a recreation of Paolozzi's studio and a gallery dedicated to him. I'd just like to finish by saying that Keiller's collecting practices, in particular her attention to the ephemera of the movements that her collection revolved around, continue to influence the collecting activities of the Gallery of Modern Art. So in 2016, we were awarded a grant from the Art Fund to begin a collection of performance art from scratch. The understanding that collecting is a practice of acquiring knowledge as well as objects has been thrown into sharp focus for us now as we think about ways of initiating and building such a collection in a way that feels relevant and adequately representative of such a multifaceted medium. So the domain of performance has, because of its ephemeral nature, has traditionally been the archive. So we must think about what it means for the boundaries between archive and collections to blur. Keiller's collection might offer an insight into an approach to collecting that deliberately sets out to gather, through various means, the ephemeral thoughts, processes, relationships, negotiations, as well as the objects produced by artistic activity, and the way that she collected the past through the lens of her relationship with contemporary artists. So in essence, Gabrielle Keiller collection gives an insight into what it means to collect art in an expanded way. So thank you.